Dr. Moyo, Mr. Secretary General, thank you for taking a few minutes of your time to discuss this with us. We know it, the challenges, the context, the humanitarian context is changing. There's much more pressure, much more demand for humanitarian support because of interrelated global trends. We know that humanitarian emergencies are affecting the normal growth and progress of certain developing countries. We know that in certain countries, proactive has become the new normal. When we do an appeal right now, 90% of our appeals actually last for more than 3 years. But at the same time, we're seeing much more effective awareness systems. We're seeing new actors. We're seeing more technology. We have more middle-income countries that are able to provide support. The context, the landscape of the humanitarian environment is changing. So my first question goes to you, Dr. Moyo. Looking at the trends and projections for the next 15 years, would you say that the global humanitarian structure and actions are fit for purpose, or are they ready for the challenges of the future?
So thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here in Geneva, and I really appreciate the invitation to share with you some of my thinking about where the world is today and how, in particular, we can all rally behind some of the challenges and try to figure out not just short-term tactical solutions to many of the emergency crises that we're dealing with, but also think more long-term about the structural challenges that the world continues to face going forward. I think it would be slightly arrogant of me to speak to a room of experts on humanitarian interventions and to suggest that I could opine on the specifics of how you might be able to engage with some of the challenges facing the world today. Nevertheless, what I would like to do is perhaps frame my answer by giving a little bit more context as to how the world appears to be evolving using this sort of two-phased aspect that I addressed a moment ago, which is the tactical short-term emergencies that we're facing today and some of the longer-term structural challenges that I believe will become even more difficult in the next several years. So clearly, in terms of the tactical environment, the world continues to struggle to emerge from the financial crisis of 2008. It's very clear that not just developing countries where 90% of the world's population lives and where on average 60 to 70% of the population is under the age of 25, we're continuing to see significant reductions of economic growth and also real challenges that are now spewing into the political environment. But it's not just about the developing environment, it's also about the developed economies, where today we are seeing considerable concerns around the weight of debts and deficits, but also the erosion of both the quality and quantity of labor, and finally challenges around productivity, and all of these feeding into a lower growth scenario for developed countries also. I think that there's sort of three things that I would argue are very important in terms of being able to address not just the structural economic growth challenges that I've just alluded to, but also to some of the challenges such as the migration crisis, which is we're dealing with head-on. And I think there are three key aspects in particular that we need to frame in terms of addressing our role in being quite effective to address these things. First of all, I think that we have a predilection to be quite myopic. And unfortunately, I think public policy has to become more long-term in order to address many of the fundamental challenges that we're seeing today, whether it's disease burdens or environmental challenges, or indeed even the radicalization of terrorist groups. I think it's also very important that we continue to ensure that we don't have a zero-sum approach to public policy making. I think one of the challenges that the environmental and climate change movement has faced over the last several decades, and hopefully will be resolved or move much closer in the conversations in Paris, has been that there has been a sense that public policy, even at the international level, has winners and losers. And that, for example, in the environmental case, there's a real concern that in order to implement many of the climate change challenges, whether it's CO2 emissions or water concerns, it necessarily means that countries, particularly in the emerging markets, will not be able to deliver growth. So that tone of us versus them, or some concerns around winners and losers, has seeped not just into climate change issues, but even into economic growth with trade policies such as the Common Agriculture Policy in Europe, which tends to focus more on, certainly in view of many people, on benefiting a few people in Europe and even in the United States at the expense of many farmers around the world. The third key aspect that we really need to bring into the discussion is about how the integration of the world really matters. And by that I mean, there's really, to me, an important role for understanding that what happens in developed countries is absolutely linked to what is going on in the emerging markets. Now, if you think about it, that was really the essence of the globalization movement of the 1990s and onwards, even 1980s. But I would still argue that there's a tone of every nation for itself, and this has become very deleterious for public policy making. Now, some of you in the room might be saying to yourselves, well, how does this feed into our own work, which is not entirely, but is largely driven by being responsive to the challenges that very often we see in immediacy, whether it's an emergency humanitarian action or real concerns that emanate from climate change or disasters. And I would argue that the discussion has to rely on a blurring of the lines between people who are talking about the structural problems of economic growth and long-term challenges that I've just addressed, with some of the emergency challenges that we're facing, even if it's the immigration crisis here in Europe. Those two things cannot be seen as separate. Now, in terms of implementation, I think that I would really leave it to you to be able to articulate how we can actually blur that distinction. But nevertheless, I would argue that there is an absolute moral imperative, but beyond that, an absolute imperative for humanitarian action to be seen as part and parcel of the economic and political challenges, and indeed the social challenges that the world continues to deal with today. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. So moving away from long-term policy, moving to long-term policies, away from zero-sum, making sure we have a better integration, and of course blurring the lines between what we're calling development and we're calling humanitarian response. Mr. Secretary General, you were at the front lines with our volunteers in Ebola. You were with our national societies during the migration crisis. What do you think we need to do differently in the next 15 years to be fit for purpose?
Thank you very much. Maybe to building on what Dr. Moyes says, what do those changes mean for us concretely? If we look at the kind of challenges that we are facing from a humanitarian perspective, they're related to shocks, stresses, and crises that may be related to violence and conflict on the one hand, and that is key. We're a movement that was born out of a battlefield, Solferino. It had a name, it had a place, distinctive geographic confine that we could see. What has changed dramatically since then is that many more battlefields appeared, but without names, without any geographic confine. And today, the reality of our work reminds us that the battlefield is everywhere. It is on the streets of the biggest capitals in the world. It is in places of worships. It is in schools. And if you walk into this conference and then you see that ambulance out there, you can realize also that even, those emblems and symbols, that used to be the ones, coming out there to do humanitarian work, are no longer so protected than they used to be. That's a big change for us. The second change is that, when those conflicts start, and even though we don't even know the battlefield, we know sometimes when they start, we never know when they end. Well, today, many of us, are still working in places, like Somalia, in some parts of the Congo, in South Sudan, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and many other places in the world. but very few of us even remember when those conflicts, started. We are going to go into our fourth winter or fifth winter in many parts of the Middle East, including in Syria, and we are not seeing yet any perspective of a political solution to a problem that will require a political solution. That means then, coming back to your blurring lines, that the lines get blurred between what we used to understand as a development issue, then comes a shock, it becomes an emergency. The emergency gets over in a short period of time, we go back, we go into a recovery phase, those lines getting blurred and blurred by the day, and then with all the dangers of relapse that we see in the same kind of a continuum that we are facing. What does it mean for us? For us, it means that on the one hand, we need to equip ourselves and then prepare to respond, of course, to acute crises and shocks, because it's about alleviating human suffering and do everything possible that those who are trapped in the middle of conflicts and shocks over which they do not have any control are brought back to what matters to us, which is our shared humanity, and then responding to them. The lines get blurred because the same people suffer the multiple deprivations. It is not, if we're unlucky, impossible, that you be in a refugee camp and then you see the same child that you save out of malnutrition, grow up and then having to face difficulties in getting into a school, being stateless, most of the time in his or her childhood, and like it happened to me in Dadaab, find people in their 20s who were born in that same refugee camp and still live there without a prospect on what the future is. What has changed also is that those vulnerabilities and fragilities globalize. They do globalize in the same way that the world is global. We find them everywhere. As paradoxical as it may sound, we are seeing now almost the majority of the poor living in middle-income and high-income country. That cohabitation is a deadly one because it is a cohabitation that puts to the fore the disparities and the gaps between the rich and the poor, the inequalities. It also put the inequalities and then gaps between the rural and the urban areas, particularly in the face of a rapid, unplanned urbanization. It forces us also to shift our paradigms, many of which were based on rural model of development, to better understand how can that be applied in an urban setting. It brings new forms of violence that needs to be addressed on a daily basis, not only in those places that might be considered to be the fragile countries or the fragile cities. All of that bring it back to the communities. Communities waking every day up, developing strategies for survivals and coping mechanisms. And today, those coping mechanisms are being stretched to the maximum. And that makes also our humanitarian agenda to become a big challenge. Number of things that we need to take into account looking ahead, that we need to certainly change. Governance needs to change. Economic governance is extremely important. A decision to allocate your land in your country and what are the mechanisms through which communities participate so that those decisions respond to their needs is going to be extremely critical. It is a choice that to see what this most fertile land will be used to grow flowers or to be exported in the next days through the plane, or to grow food for people to eat. That is a basic, major economic governance decision that has to be made. The governance of water, it's going to be critical. Now, many of the conflicts in the past were about mineral and natural resources. If we're not careful, the next generation of conflict may be related to access to water because it is central to everything that we're doing. That is another part of governance. It is about also keeping the promises we make to communities. So many promises made for long, so many promises broken for a long time. Health for all by the year 2000. We are in 2015. The decade of water that was back in Almata, that was in the 80s, early 80s. We're in 2015, where are we? We're coming with new promises, education for all, every woman, every child, no one left behind. And we should remember that communities also, they have an opinion, they have a memory. And then they remember if we're keeping those promises. And the basis for partnership and solidarity going into the future would be a long-term engagement and involvement with those communities to accompany them, to build trust, to build partnership. And then the best way to do that definitely will be about building the promises we made in addressing those very issues that are more critical to them. And that will be definitely, if not a majority, but a significant part of the agenda for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Keeping the promises we've made to the communities essential, addressing the issues of governance, and I think you both agree that we need to blur the lines between what we're calling humanitarian and development, because these are the same communities dealing with both. Now, globally, though, the resources for these two interventions are in two separate pots. And you, Dr. Moyo, have written in your book, Dead Aid, that actually, for example, in the case of Africa, aid has a number of negative consequences for the continent. In this repackaging or re-envisioning of how we support communities that deal with this whole continuum of challenges, where do you see development assistance?
So thank you again, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify exactly what my book was criticizing, because I think, unfortunately, talking about blurring lines, I think there was a predilection to blur the lines on what aid I was referring to. I have to also say it actually was written on page 7 of the book. I was very clear because I was worried about misinterpretation, and unfortunately, I was not able to get ahead of the what I consider to be quite deliberate blurring of the lines. There are 3, to my mind, essentially approaches to aid. The first one is humanitarian aid, which I argued in the book, and I still firmly believe there is a moral imperative for us to act. If we are, and I think the Power of Humanity slogan really captures that, if we believe we are all part of a human family, a global human family, then we surely cannot stand by the sidelines when, whether it's any form of atrocity is occurring en masse, wherever it may be occurring. And I think it's very essential for us to argue and to continue to defend the fact that there is a role for the international community to act when there is a humanitarian crisis, whether it's climate change driven, a flood, Katrina, or a tsunami. We ought to act. The second form of aid is really what I argued was relatively small forms of aid, given the challenges of GDP growth, but also government public purse, which was really NGO activities, especially around this time of the year, which is coming into the Christmas period, where there are lots of campaigns to build a well in Zambia, or to build a school in Thailand, etc. We are very familiar with these type of campaigns. I argued there that I can understand why there might be a predilection for people to want to support those type of campaigns, but there also should not be an illusion that somehow these types of campaigns were at the scale enough to create the economic growth and to meaningfully put a dent in poverty, which is ultimately what we needed. And then the final pocket of aid, which is really the aid that I was critiquing, is the large hundreds of billions of dollars of aid that goes to particularly emerging countries, from other countries, developed market countries, but also from international agencies. I think it's just, if you would permit me to spend a moment just to explain why I had a problem and why I continue to feel that there's a lot more reform that needs to occur in that third bucket. And I should say right off the bat, it's not to say that the other forms of international action and in the aid form do not need to be reformed. I think that that's part of the discussion we're having here, that we need to blur those lines. We need to understand that there's a broader context. But it's very important to me that we understand that I was critiquing that third bucket because it is different in its nature and also the challenges that it brings to bear in the recipient country. What is my concern with the third bucket of aid? So first of all, to put it in context, in the history of the world, certainly as long as economists have been and historians have been recording economic history and economic success and failure, there has been no country in the planet that has ever achieved economic growth and meaningfully put a dent in poverty while relying on aid, both in terms of the extent of the amount of aid in which they rely upon, but also for the period of the amount of aid that many African countries have relied on aid. So that is a fundamental point that we need to understand. If we really believe that these countries, and I'm picking on Africa because I am an African, but obviously this pertains to South America and across Asia, many other emerging places around the world. But if we really believe that we want to see these countries achieve economic success and improve living standards and reduce poverty, we have to understand that there is no evidence that providing aid at the scale and for the period, which is essentially an open-ended commitment for the period that aid has been going on, there's no evidence that that has contributed to long-term economic success. Now, I don't want to, and I'm not here to rehash the whole book, but I will say that there, of course, has been evidence that aid at that sort of systemic level can be helpful and has been helpful. The Marshall Plan is a classic example of this. $100 billion in today's terms, it was about $13 billion at the time, clearly was helpful in terms of reconstructing Europe in the post-war era. We have seen other interventions. The aid graduates, countries like Botswana, South Korea, are just a few examples of countries that have received aid and have been able to create economic turnaround situations. I think the 2 points I'd like to close on is, first, we need to understand that in both those examples, and there are numerous other examples, the interventions were short, sharp, and finite. So the Marshall Plan, for example, was a 5-year project. And I think this really bleeds into the psychology of why aid can be quite deleterious and problematic for long-term economic success in the recipient country. What do I mean by that? Well, if we believe that having a society where somebody, and in the context of the infrastructure that we live in today, that context is the somebody is the government, must be held responsible for economic success and failure, and social success and failure, and even indeed political success or failure of a society, then the people in those countries have to be able to hold their government accountable in a credible and sustained way. How do we do that in more developed economies, especially developed in the sense of political development? Well, through democracy, there's an implicit contract between the individual, taxpayer, and the government. And it's a very simple contract. The government says, I'm going to tax you, and we say, sure. And in return for that taxation, I'm going to provide you with a suite of public goods: education, healthcare, infrastructure, national security, etc. If the government fails to deliver on that promise, we basically are allowed to go and vote them out at the next election. That is basically the system, and that contract is held sacrosanct. The problem with the aid system, and again, just to emphasize, I'm talking about the systemic aid system, is that it breaks that contract. In essence, governments are very rationally incentivized to court and cater to agencies outside of their taxpayers in order to please a certain suite of public goods defined by those outside agents. Put another way, if I am a citizen, I am no longer able to hold my government accountable because they're not relying on my tax base to keep them in power or to keep them sweet to deliver on the projects that they've promised me. Now, it's a whole other discussion about the tax base, how we can grow the tax base, how do we encourage and ensure that we can create a society where governments are accountable. But I think it's really important that what in essence happens in the world that I've just described, where this contract is broken, is that governments in the recipient countries very logically and very rationally, I might point out, these governments are not clueless or in any way sort of stupid. They're very calculated and smart people who are making the decision to understand that the flows of aid essentially become long-term and permanent flows of their budget. So the erosion that occurs is really the undermining of the political contract. And I think that is where the problem of aid really emerges. Now, it's not to say that we should go off and turn the taps today. I do think, however, we really need to do a better job at rewarding governments for doing the right thing. A president I had the good fortune of meeting with, who I will protect his identity, I will say he did make the following remark to me. He said, you have to understand that the aid system has become so corrupt that governments are actually encouraged, basically de facto encouraged, if not de jure, to show more poverty, show more disease, show more sort of breakdown of their societies in order to get more aid. So the governments that show improvements are actually not getting rewarded, which is a system I think we should think about. It's the governments that are showing a worse performance are the ones that receive aid. And I think in that context, it once again creates a lot of problems for society.
Thank you very much, and we're going to get back to that, and we're anxious to get, of course, our members involved in this discussion as well, as I'm sure you have questions for our panelists. But before we do, Mr. Secretary General, you yourself in this issue of blurring have often talked about building resilience as sort of a paradigm that can merge the emergency with the longer-term preparedness and, of course, longer-term recovery/development efforts. What does resilience mean at this point for us?
Many of the challenges we face, they come in a cyclic, way. We know that almost every year, the Zambezi River will get out of its bed and it may flood part of Zambia, Mozambique, Malawi, year after year. This year, like next year, there will be a monsoon season. There will be a cyclone season. Well, should we always, be waiting for the shock, to arrive, and then we respond, and then we wait for the next shock arrive, and we respond again? Should we be measuring, our success year after year in the growing number of people in need that we cover? When every evaluator will tell you, excellent, you did covering 5,000 people this year, and then the year after you've covered 10,000, good progress. Well, it's not a good progress. If it was really good, the year after we would not have, double the number of people in need. Now, to talk about resilience, then we need to go all the way back to see how do we prepare? How do we prepare in terms of making use of the information that is available and exploring also the new information that may be useful for us? How can we have, early warning and early alert systems in place? And that is not enough unless it is accompanied by an early action that goes with it. That is still not enough. When we respond, what is the kind of a capacity that we are building and then the lessons that we are learning so that we have a baseline upon which we'll be operating from next time around, the shock will arrive. Now, the capacity, for that same community to withstand the same shock which is recovering will be already an indicator, of resilience. And more importantly, maybe it is the capacity even to bounce back and then bounce back better, so that we draw the lessons in a manner that we do not have, the same, type of infrastructure and constructions, that will be suffering the same kind of a damage, year after year. We will not, have to protect year after year the same livestock and then the same livelihood that we have to be rebuilt. And it means, again, coming back to the blurring line. And for us, resilience means, to put it in simple terms, how can we be there and be there all the time to accompany those people to understand the different, crises and eventually stresses that may face, build the capacity to respond, build the capacity to withstand, the further shocks, and have the capacity to protect, at the end of the day, the lives, the livelihoods, and then the ways of lives, that comes with it, which can be also a contributor, to the peace. That cannot happen in isolation. Hence, the very importance of the discussion we're having this morning, the necessity of having governance structures, that work in place, the great culture of accountability, to come back to the first point we made, to keep the promises that we make also to these communities. And that can only happen if the basis of trust and partnership is built, at a long term. And most of the time, what we see, in order to have a good development program or a sustainable response that will be leading, to resilience, it requires a long healing process, a healing of relationships that are broken, a healing, of mistrust that is prevailing, a healing of historical events, that people are still trying to recover from. But we have seen also that individuals and the different forms of organization, starting from the family as well as the community-based organization, are able, to make, that change. And I think that's where we join up with, maybe your last point, Dr. Moyo, to say that aid, of course, if it is, as part of our shared responsibility to looking at our shared humanity and contributing into it, to make this world a better place by alleviating human suffering, absolutely, yes. And there are many other dysfunctionalities that needs to be addressed while that is happening that cannot be blamed, to aid, but can be blamed, to a responsibility that has to be taken, by those who are in power, in governance, and also the systemic approaches, that are systemic mechanisms that are guiding, the globalization of the world that needs to be acted on, meaning, trade, meaning the terms, of trade, meaning also, the type of priorities, people will be setting, and then the joint commitment to investing in. While we are sitting here, there is a discussion going on in Paris. It started in Stockholm, 1972, at the time that many of the people who are negotiating right now in Paris maybe were not even born. And we are putting back on the table the same issues that really call on a shared accountability, that also we have to keep the promises that we make.
Thank you so much. I'm very anxious to hear also your views on resilience, but I think we need to bring some of our members in. Questions, comments? Kazakhstan, please.
Большое спасибо, что предоставили слово.